August 3, 1938, 9:47 a.m. Federal Court, Southern District of New York. Stephanie St. Clair walked into the courtroom, knowing she'd lost everything. The Italian mob had finally succeeded where they'd failed for a decade. They'd pushed her out of Harlem. Her numbers operation was gone, taken over by Dutch Schultz's successor. Her runners had been threatened into working for the mob. Her collection points were now controlled by Italian enforcers. Even her most loyal people had no choice but to submit. The five families had won. They owned Harlem now. Stephanie was finished, or so they thought. What the mob bosses sitting in that courtroom didn't know, what their high-priced lawyers couldn't imagine, was that Stephanie St. Clair hadn't come to surrender. She'd come to detonate a bomb that would shake the New York underworld to its foundation. In the next 42 minutes, Stephanie would reveal secrets that the mob had killed to protect. She would name names, expose operations, and detail a corruption network so vast that it would trigger the largest organized crime investigation in American history. And when she was done, when she finally stopped talking, the five family bosses sitting in that courtroom would be frozen in their seats, unable to speak, unable to move, realizing too late that pushing Stephanie St. Clair out of Harlem was the biggest mistake they'd ever made. To understand what happened in that courtroom, you need to understand how the mob finally succeeded in shutting Stephanie out. It wasn't through one dramatic confrontation. It was through systematic, relentless pressure over 18 months. After Dutch Schultz was killed in 1935, the five families had regrouped. They'd learned that direct confrontation with Stephanie didn't work. She was too smart, too prepared, too willing to fight back. So they changed tactics. Instead of trying to kill or intimidate Stephanie directly, they went after her infrastructure. They targeted her runners, offering them more money to switch sides or threatening their families if they didn't. They bribed the same cops Stephanie had been paying, offering double what she could afford. They bought the buildings where her collection points operated and evicted her people. They squeezed her suppliers, her bankers, everyone in her network. By early 1938, Stephanie's operation had shrunk by 70%. She went from controlling most of Harlem's numbers racket to holding on to a few blocks. Her income dropped from $200,000 a year to maybe $30,000. She was still fighting, still refusing to surrender, but she was losing. The final blow came in June 1938 when Lucky Luciano, even while imprisoned, sent word through his organization that any remaining business with Stephanie St. Clair would be considered an act of war against the five families. That was it. The last of her runners switched sides. The last of her collection points closed. By July 1938, Stephanie St. Clair's numbers operation, the empire she'd built from nothing over 15 years, was completely destroyed. But here's what the mob didn't understand about Stephanie. Losing her business didn't break her, it freed her. For 15 years, Stephanie had kept secrets. She'd watched the mob operate, documented their corruption, tracked their money, identified their partners in law enforcement and government. She'd kept all of this information locked away because revealing it would have triggered a war she might not survive. But now she had nothing left to lose. If they'd left her even a small piece of her operation, she would have protected those secrets to avoid retaliation. But they'd taken everything, so she had no reason to stay quiet anymore. In late July 1938, Stephanie did something that shocked everyone. She walked into the FBI field office in Manhattan and asked to speak to the agent in charge. Special Agent Thomas Dewey, yes, that Thomas Dewey, who would later become governor and almost president, met with her personally. "Miss St. Clair, what brings you to the FBI?" Dewey asked, curious but skeptical. Stephanie set a briefcase on his desk. "I have information about organized crime operations in New York. Detailed information. Names, dates, amounts, operations, everything." Dewey leaned back in his chair. "You're a known criminal yourself. Why would you help us?" "Because the Italian mob just destroyed my business and pushed me out of Harlem. I have nothing left to lose and no reason to protect their secrets anymore. So I'm going to burn them all down. The only question is whether you want to be part of it." Dewey opened the briefcase. Inside were hundreds of pages of documents, photographs, ledgers, and handwritten notes. He spent the next hour reviewing them, his eyes getting wider with each page. Where did you get all this? I've been collecting it for 15 years. Every meeting I witnessed, every payoff I saw, every corrupt cop and politician I identified. I documented everything because I knew someday I might need leverage. That day is today. Dewey closed the briefcase. Miss St. Clair, if even half of what's in here is accurate, this is the most comprehensive look at organized crime we've ever had. But you understand that testifying about this will put a target on your back? Stephanie smiled coldly. Agent Dewey, I've had a target on my back since 1925. The difference is now I'm shooting back. Over the next week, FBI agents verified Stephanie's information. They cross-referenced her documents with their own intelligence. They confirmed names, dates, and operations. Everything checked out. Stephanie St. Clair had handed them a roadmap to the mob's entire New York operation. Dewey made a decision. He would convene a federal grand jury to investigate organized crime in New York, and Stephanie St. Clair would be his star witness. The hearing was scheduled for August 3, 1938. When news broke that Stephanie would be testifying before a federal grand jury, the mob panicked. Frank Costello called an emergency meeting of the 5 families. She's going to talk. She knows too much. We need to stop her. How? Carlo Gambino asked. She's in federal custody. She's surrounded by FBI agents. We can't get to her. Then we make sure her testimony doesn't matter, Costello said. We get our lawyers in that courtroom. We make her look like a liar, a bitter criminal trying to get revenge. We destroy her credibility. That's why on August 3, 1938, the courtroom was packed with mob lawyers. 5 different law firms, all representing various business interests that might be affected by Stephanie's testimony. And in the gallery, sitting in the back rows trying to look inconspicuous, were representatives of all 5 families. They wanted to hear exactly what Stephanie would say. The hearing began at 10 a.m. Federal Judge Lawrence Whitman presided. Agent Dewey sat at the prosecutor's table, and Stephanie St. Clair, wearing an elegant black suit that made her look more like a businesswoman than a gangster, sat in the witness chair. Judge Whitman addressed her formally. Miss St. Clair, you understand you're under oath? Everything you say here is subject to perjury charges if proven false. I understand, Your Honor. Everything I'm about to tell you is true. I have documentation to prove it. Then please proceed. Stephanie took a deep breath. This was it. The moment she'd been preparing for. Your Honor, for the past 15 years I've operated a numbers banking business in Harlem. During that time I've witnessed systematic corruption involving organized crime, law enforcement, and government officials. I'm here today to detail that corruption. She opened a folder in front of her. Let's start with the New York Police Department. The following officers have been receiving regular payoffs from the Italian mob to ignore their operations and harass their competitors. Stephanie began reading names. Captains, lieutenants, sergeants, beat cops. She didn't just name them. She provided specific amounts, dates of payments, and which mob figures made the payments. The courtroom went silent. Reporters scribbled frantically. The mob lawyers looked at each other nervously. Captain Edward Murphy of the 32nd Precinct has received approximately $2,000 per month from representatives of Frank Costello since 1933. I personally witnessed 3 of these payments. I have photographs of 2 more. She slid photographs across to Judge Whitman. Lieutenant Richard Morrison of the 28th Precinct received a payment of $5,000 in January 1936 to raid my operation, while ignoring identical operations run by the mob. I have a sworn affidavit from a witness who was present during that payment. More documents. The mob bosses in the gallery were no longer trying to look inconspicuous. They were sitting forward, rigid with tension. Now let's discuss judges, Stephanie continued. The following members of the judiciary have accepted bribes or campaign contributions from mob-connected sources in exchange for favorable rulings. She named 3 judges. For each one, she provided evidence. Campaign contribution records, photographs of meetings, testimony from witnesses. One of the named judges was actually in the courtroom as an observer. His face went white. Judge Walter Harrison, who sentenced me in 1935 in a case based on fabricated evidence, received $10,000 in campaign contributions from shell companies controlled by Dutch Schultz. I have the bank records showing the transfers. Stephanie was just getting started. She moved on to politicians, city councilmen who'd taken bribes to ignore mob operations in their districts, state legislators who'd killed bills that would have increased penalties for organized crime. Even a congressman who'd received $50,000 to advocate for lenient federal policies. For each accusation, she had evidence. Not hearsay, not rumors, but documents, photographs, bank records, testimonies. It was devastating. But then Stephanie did something that truly froze the mob bosses in their seats. She started naming their operations. Frank Costello controls the slot machine racket throughout New York through a network of shell companies. The primary one is True Mint Novelty Company, which owns approximately 5,000 machines, generating $2 million annually. The company is nominally owned by William Allen, but the real owner is Costello. I have corporate documents proving this. She slid more papers to the judge. The mob lawyers were on their feet objecting, but Judge Whitman waved them down. Miss St. Clair is providing evidence. Unless you can demonstrate it's false, she will continue. Stephanie continued. Carlo Gambino runs loan sharking operations in Brooklyn and Queens through a network of enforcers. The operation lends approximately $500,000 per year at interest rates between 10% and 30% per week. The primary enforcers are Thomas Bilotti, Paul Castellano, and Joseph Biondo. I have ledgers documenting loans and payments. Vito Genovese controls the heroin trade in East Harlem through an arrangement with importers in Sicily. Approximately 50 kilograms of heroin enters New York monthly through the Port of New York. The primary distributor is Anthony Strollo. I have shipping manifests and witness testimony. The courtroom was in absolute chaos now. Reporters were running out to call their editors. The mob lawyers were shouting objections. The gallery was in an uproar, but Judge Whitman was fascinated. He banged his gavel for order but allowed Stephanie to continue. Joseph Bonanno operates illegal gambling houses in the Bronx disguised as social clubs. The primary locations are... She listed addresses. Tommy Lucchese controls the garment district through union corruption. He's placed his people in leadership positions of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and uses threats and violence to extract payments from manufacturers. For 42 minutes, Stephanie talked. She detailed operations, named participants, provided evidence. She exposed the entire structure of organized crime in New York, not in general terms, but with specific, prosecutable details. And throughout it all, she remained calm, composed, methodical. This wasn't an angry tirade. This was a professional presentation. When she finally finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Whitman looked at the mountain of evidence on his bench. Miss St. Clair, this is extensive. Are you prepared to testify to all of this in criminal trials? Yes, Your Honor. I'm prepared to testify against anyone named in these documents. Whitman turned to Agent Dewey. How much of this have you verified? Approximately 60% so far, Your Honor. Everything we've checked has been accurate. We're continuing to verify the rest, but based on what we've confirmed, I believe Miss St. Clair's testimony is reliable. Whitman made his decision. This grand jury will issue subpoenas for everyone named in Miss St. Clair's testimony. We will conduct a full investigation into organized crime operations in New York. This hearing is adjourned. As the courtroom cleared, the mob bosses sat frozen in their seats. They'd come expecting to watch Stephanie embarrass herself, to see her accusations dismissed as the ravings of a bitter criminal. Instead, they just heard her detail their entire operation with evidence that could send dozens of people to prison. Frank Costello's hands were shaking. Carlo Gambino looked physically ill. The others just sat there, unable to process what had just happened. Outside the courthouse, Stephanie was immediately surrounded by FBI agents. They would provide 24-hour protection. The mob would absolutely try to kill her now. But Stephanie wasn't afraid. For the first time in months, she felt powerful again. A reporter managed to shout a question through the security cordon. Miss St. Clair, aren't you afraid the mob will retaliate? Stephanie stopped and turned to face the cameras. They already took everything from me. My business, my livelihood, my place in Harlem. They thought that would silence me. They were wrong. When you have nothing left to lose, you become the most dangerous person in the room. And today, I showed them exactly how dangerous I can be. The impact of Stephanie's testimony was immediate and catastrophic for the mob. Within a week, federal grand juries issued 73 indictments. 32 police officers were suspended pending investigation. 8 judges recused themselves from cases or resigned. 5 politicians announced they wouldn't seek re-election. The mob's operations didn't stop, but they were severely disrupted. Suddenly, the cops they'd been paying were under investigation and couldn't provide protection. The judges they'd bought were being watched too closely to help. The politicians they'd controlled were desperate to distance themselves. Frank Costello's slot machine operation was raided by federal agents. They seized 2,000 machines exactly as Stephanie had described. Carlo Gambino's loan sharking network was exposed. Dozens of victims came forward, no longer afraid because the protection system had collapsed. Vito Genovese, who'd already been hiding in Italy to avoid charges, now faced new federal warrants. The heroin operation Stephanie exposed was shut down. Tommy Lucchese's garment district control was broken when federal investigators moved in and cleaned out the corrupted union leadership. The 5 families called another emergency meeting 2 weeks after Stephanie's testimony. The mood was apocalyptic. "She destroyed us," Gambino said flatly. "One woman in one morning did more damage to our operations than the FBI has done in 20 years. We need to kill her," someone suggested. Costello shook his head. "She's in federal protection. We can't get to her. And even if we could, killing her now would just prove everything she said was true. We'd have every federal agent in the country coming after us." "So what do? "We survive," Costello said. "We take our losses. We rebuild quietly. We learn from this. And we never, ever push someone so hard that they have nothing left to lose." It was a bitter lesson, learned at tremendous cost. But here's the thing about Stephanie's testimony that made it so devastating. She wasn't just exposing the mob. She was exposing the entire corrupt system that allowed them to operate. The cops who took bribes, the judges who fixed cases, the politicians who looked the other way. She burned down the whole structure. In the months and years that followed, New York's criminal justice system underwent a massive reform. Thomas Dewey, who'd taken Stephanie's testimony, used it to launch his political career. He became Manhattan District Attorney, then Governor of New York, nearly became president. His entire reputation was built on prosecuting organized crime, and it started with Stephanie St. Clair's testimony. Dozens of corrupt officials were removed from office. The NYPD underwent major internal investigations. The judicial system implemented new ethics rules. It wasn't perfect. Corruption didn't disappear, but it was significantly reduced. As for Stephanie, she never returned to the numbers racket. With federal protection and a small pension from the government for her cooperation, she lived quietly in Harlem for the rest of her life. The mob left her alone. They'd learned their lesson. In 1960, a young journalist interviewed Stephanie for a magazine article. He asked her about the decision to testify. "Do you regret it? Exposing all those secrets?" Stephanie thought for a moment. "No. They thought they could take everything from me and I'd just disappear. They thought wrong. I built something in Harlem and they destroyed it. So I destroyed what they'd built. Fair exchange." "But you lost your empire." "I lost a business," Stephanie corrected. "But I kept something more important. I kept my dignity. I kept my ability to fight back. They took my operation, but I took their peace of mind. Every mob boss in New York spent years looking over their shoulder because of what I revealed. That's worth more than money." The journalist pressed further. "What would you say to people who call you a criminal trying to get revenge?" Stephanie smiled. "I'd say they're half right. I was a criminal. I broke laws. But everything I revealed in that courtroom was true. The mob was worse than I ever was. They just had better PR." Years later, historians studying organized crime in America always come back to Stephanie St. Clair's 1938 testimony. It's cited as one of the most comprehensive exposures of mob operations ever given. Law enforcement agencies still study it as an example of how insider testimony can dismantle criminal organizations. But the real significance of that day, in August 1938, isn't just about crime or punishment. It's about power and how it can shift in unexpected ways. The five families thought they'd won. They'd pushed Stephanie out of Harlem, destroyed her business, taken her territory. They thought the war was over. They didn't understand that taking everything from someone doesn't make them powerless. Sometimes it makes them unstoppable. Because someone with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous enemy you can create. Stephanie St. Clair sat in that witness chair with no business to protect, no employees to worry about, no operations to preserve. She was free to tell the truth, and the truth delivered with evidence and precision was more powerful than any weapon the mob possessed. In 42 minutes, she brought down an empire that had taken decades to build. The Mafia shut Stephanie St. Clair out of Harlem, thinking they'd silenced her forever. What she revealed in court froze them because they realized too late that they hadn't defeated her. They'd unleashed her. They'd removed the one thing that kept her quiet, the need to protect what she'd built. And once that was gone, she had no reason to keep their secrets anymore. The mob bosses who sat in that courtroom watching Stephanie testify learned something that day. You can take someone's business. You can take their money. You can take their territory, but you can't take their knowledge. You can't take their memory. You can't take their ability to speak truth to power. And when you push someone hard enough, when you take absolutely everything from them, you better hope they don't know your secrets. Because Stephanie St. Clair knew all their secrets, and on August 3rd, 1938, she told the world. That's why they froze. That's why they couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but sit there and watch their empire crack apart. They'd won the battle for Harlem, but Stephanie St. Clair won the war, not by being stronger, not by being richer, not by being more violent, but by being smarter, more prepared, and more willing to burn everything down rather than let her enemies enjoy their victory. That's real power. That's what the mob forgot, and that's what Stephanie St. Clair proved in 42 minutes of devastating testimony that changed the New York underworld forever.